Hi friends, I'm Amy Julia Becker, and this is Love is Stronger Than Fear, a podcast about pursuing hope and healing in the midst of social division. In this season, we're talking about my book, White Picket Fences, and today I get to talk about privilege and blessing and vulnerability and authority and human flourishing, and I get to do that with my friend and the prolific author, speaker, and teacher, Andy Crouch. If you're not familiar with Andy, I think you're in for a treat. If you've heard Andy speak before or you have read some of his books, this really is an opportunity to go deeper and explore more. And I will say, especially on this day, as we enter the end of a tumultuous national election season, I'm really excited for you to be able to listen to this conversation. Andy and I do talk about the election, and we talk about the role politics plays in human flourishing, even though we don't know how this election is going to turn out. I'm excited about where this conversation lands because I believe it's highly relevant to our current moment and yet also timeless because it considers always what does it mean to be a human being who is willing to take risks in love and for love. I got so much out of this. I'm actually going to listen to this conversation multiple times again for my own benefit because there was so much wisdom in it. So I'm thrilled to share it with you today. Andy Crouch, I'm so glad that you are here with me and with us and giving us your time today. So welcome.
Thank you, Amy Julia. It's great to get to talk.
Thanks. Just to give our listeners a sense of who you are, I have been reading your work for many years. Long before I knew you, I read Culture Making right when it first came out. And I can literally remember walking around Richmond, Virginia, where I first read it and when I lived at the time, thinking about who are the 12 people in my life who can help come around me as I endeavor to become a writer and to communicate these things. So anyway, you have had an influence in me for a long time. I'm pretty sure I've read every other book that you've written, and I have listened to your podcast. I'm like a fangirl here, in addition to knowing you personally and appreciating your personal counsel over the years. And actually, I'm going to add this, because I'm not sure there are many people who can say this. We have even made our children read your most recent book, Tech-Wise Family, before they were allowed to petition for a texting account. So we're like a big fan family. So all this is by way of recommending to any listener your books, your podcast, your other writing. And I certainly will put a link to all of that in the show notes. And I just encourage people to go and check it out because of how you have been thoughtfully communicating about faith and culture for a very long time. But there's one book in particular that I've asked you to be here today to talk about, and it's called Strong and Weak. I have it right here, so I'm going to read the subtitle, Embracing a Life of Love, Risk, and True Flourishing. And I loved this book so much. Peter and I talked about it so much. It's a wonderful book, too, just because it's really short and accessible. And it really influenced me in writing White Picket Fences. I referred to it a lot, even though it doesn't show up by name in the book, because I think it relates to disability, education, justice, privilege, and the idea that we might participate in healing our social divisions. So I wanted to start today just by asking you to tell listeners a little bit about Strong and Weak, both in terms of how you decided to write the book and the basic premise behind it, if you could just explore and explain that a bit.
Yes, of course. I mean, let's start with the basic idea. It's super simple. It's that there are two components to a flourishing life, flourishing family, flourishing community, flourishing business, flourishing world in a way, and they are authority and vulnerability. And we often think of these as somehow, they seem like they might be opposites. Like the more authority you would have, the less vulnerable you would be. The more vulnerable you would be, we might think the less authority you have. But I'm really convinced that they're meant to go together, that they can go together, that there's this kind of paradox that when they go together, those are the best times of our lives. If we talked with almost anyone and said, what was the moment when you have felt most fully alive? If something came to mind, I think it has a component of authority, which in the book I define as capacity for meaningful action. So I'm not just talking about having a position of power or a title or a job. It's any setting in which you can act and it matters, you could say. It makes a difference, meaningful action. And then in that same peak experience, these best moments of our lives would be vulnerability, which I define as exposure to meaningful risk. That there's some element of, there really is something that could go wrong, that could be lost. And it's when you have authority and vulnerability together that you have a flourishing life and world. And the book came out of my previous book, which is a much longer book that many fewer people have read.
I read it.
I know you read it. Called Playing God, Redeeming the Gift of Power, which is kind of a deep, my attempt to go as deep as I could in the topic of power and how to think about it. And that book, I actually honestly feel like it's my I don't know if I'd say my best book, my most important book, the book that I care the most about, but it is actually my least read book because it's a topic that's uncomfortable for people, power, and it's long. And so after it had been out a little while, my editor emailed me and he said, do you have anything that you kind of left on the cutting room floor? Anything that's like, could you just write a short book? And I said, well, there's this idea in Playing God about authority and vulnerability, because I do talk about it in that book. But I had started speaking on this topic, and I had started putting it in graphical form or visual form as a 2x2, like the one thing they teach you in business school, right? Is, the 2x2 where you always want to be up and to the right, high on two dimensions at once. So when you do that with authority and vulnerability, you end up with this kind of map where the upper right corner, high authority, high vulnerability is flourishing. But then there are these three other corners. And I have to say, I was doing all this speaking about the topic of power and all the themes of the book. And this 2x2 just was connecting with other people and with me. Like every time I taught it, I would see something new in it. And I was feeling this huge regret that I hadn't figured it out for that book, because I actually think that book would have done way better if it had a picture or two in it. So I said, oh, I know exactly the thing. So Strong and Weak came out of that. And many more people have read it. I think it's actually much more helpful to many more people. And honestly, Amy Julia, you've read it in one form, or you've read the form that it got into print. But I keep teaching this. We actually use this as a core element of our training for entrepreneurs at Praxis, where I work now. And it's developed even beyond what I saw at the time I finished that book in 2017. So it of all the things I've ever written or created, like, this is the one that feels most like I discovered something, not invented, and that it just keeps giving and unfolding. So
I think that's why when I mentioned that, like, I talked about this in my own life, Peter and I have talked about it in terms of what it means to lead a team. We've talked about it in terms of our family. And again, that simplicity of this 4x4 it helps you just to be like, oh yeah, I remember, I can go back to that really easily. So can you map out the 4 quadrants for people just so that they can try to create a visual map? And of course, we'll put an image in the show notes, but for the lack of the visual right now.
Yeah, I know it's hard to do on podcasts, I've found. But Y-axis, the vertical axis, is authority. That's your capacity for meaningful action. It can be high or low in a given situation. Just to think right now, you and I both, in a way, we've created this environment where we both have capacity for meaningful action, right? Like, you have a lot because you've prepared, you've thought through the questions, you're the host, but you're also making space for me to have it. So this would be a high authority situation. Maybe we'd plot in our little, at least in certain ways. And then the x-axis, the vertical, is vulnerability. So how much is at risk? And I would actually be interested to ask, like, how vulnerable is it? I would say I always feel vulnerable during these kinds of interviews, because you sent me a brief kind of outline, but I don't know what kind of follow-up questions you're going to ask. I don't know how articulate I could be. I'm aware of a lot of risk as I come into a conversation like this, and probably you feel that too.
Absolutely.
So up and to the right, high on both, we'll call flourishing. And then if you go down, now you're in the lower right, you are high vulnerability but low authority. This would be a situation where a lot is at risk, but you really can't do anything. Maybe you're immobilized in certain ways, prevented from having capacity for meaningful action. And I think the best name for that corner, at least initially, is suffering. This is, by the way, the one corner that The other three, I'm not sure every human being experiences, but I'm pretty sure every single human being has been in a situation of vulnerability without authority. At least if you've been through middle school, you've experienced it. So then you go over to the left from there, and now you're in the lower left, which is in some ways the most interesting corner. The low vulnerability, low authority. So you don't have much capacity to act, but there's also not much risk, or at least very little sense of risk. And I would initially call this corner, and this is a little different from even how it is in the book. I think the best initial name for this is safety. So safety is an environment where I don't have to act and I don't have to risk.
Yeah.
And incidentally, we can go more into this if you want, but I would actually say this is where every healthy human life is meant to begin. And those of us who are parents, we devote so much attention in the early days, weeks, months, years of our children's lives, as to whatever extent we can, to creating an environment where actually they're limited in their authority. We don't just give them the keys to the car when they're 3 years old, right? But we also do all these things to limit their exposure to risk, if we can. Every parent would want to do that for their child. Not every parent can, but every parent would. And then finally, just to finish out the map, we go up from there. And now you have high authority, but low vulnerability. So here's the other thing I've realized since the book. It's so frustrating because the book has another name for it, which we could talk about if you want. But I've realized the real name for that corner, that upper left corner, is control. Control is when I have all the authority I want, but I don't have any risk. That's it's almost the definition of control is I can act, I can make things happen, but I know exactly how it's going to turn out. And this is kind of, I think, the dream of human life. The dream is, I wish I could be in a situation where I didn't have to risk, but I could get everything done I want to get done. We're looking for control in a way.
And it's so interesting. This is taking me a little bit off of our planned conversation already. So I'll take that risk and just say,
exactly.
I have been thinking now for a long time about the phrase that Christians use a lot about God, to say that God is in control.
In control.
And about how that interacts with the biblical idea that God is love. And the idea of biblical sovereignty. And I think that's really related to what you're saying, because I do think it can, and there's actually some measure of, I think, ultimately false comfort in God being in a place of control with no vulnerability. And of saying, you know what, he's got it. And even if I don't understand it, it's all going to work out in this almost manipulative or puppeteer way. Yeah. Whereas that place of flourishing, which I think is certainly where God intends for us to be, but even that sense of, if God came to humanity in the person of Jesus and died on a cross, well then vulnerability is really a part of the being of God. And so I'm just really, and again, I don't in any way want to say God doesn't know what's going to happen, or God is kind of powerless or something like that. But I think it's a lot more nuanced and subtle than the way that phrase, God is in control, goes out. And so that, anyway, when you just mentioned changing that quadrant or thinking about that quadrant as control, that's what came to mind.
Totally.
Yeah.
Totally. And I think, I certainly myself believe in the sovereignty of God. You can't really be you could say a small O Orthodox Christian without believing that in some sense. And it is also true that, when we talk about risk, we're talking about unknowns related to time. That is, it's often we're imagining the future, and is this going to work out for me, or is it not going to work out? Am I going to win? Am I going to lose? And that it involves the unknowability of future for us. And we don't believe, because God is not bound to time the way we human beings are, we don't believe that God experiences that kind of risk. So in that sense, God is not confused or uncertain about what's going to happen. But if you think about risk as the possibility of loss, to me, that's the very act of creation. At least, well, first of all, two things. First, God actually, it turns out, never created a mechanical universe, even before you have human beings in it. the Newtonian idea of the universe was a world that worked like a clock, and this, or a watch, the great watchmaker, right? This very complex system, but it's all mechanical. It all proceeds by rules. You could in principle chart out all the mathematics of it. Well, we now know for the last 100 years, because of quantum mechanics, that the world actually doesn't operate like a mechanism in that way. Those Newtonian laws apply at very large scales, but they don't apply at the smallest scale. And then you have a bunch of other complexities that my wife, as a physicist, actually understands, and I just draft along. But then you have so the world was built with a kind of possibility and probability at its very heart. That's what quantum mechanics tells us. And then you introduce into this human beings, whose brains, by the way, are the most complex thing in the universe, whose brains actually function on quantum mechanical levels, and who are given, even if we didn't know how our brains function, or long before we knew that, we know that God gave us a kind of freedom, right? Yeah. And the man and the woman in the biblical story are put in the garden, and God absents himself, you could say. God steps away and creates this space for them to be free. Well, at that moment, God is opening himself up to the possibility of loss. So, and then vulnerable ultimately comes from a Latin word, vulnus, which means wound, and it means woundable. And so is God woundable? Well, we have a definitive answer as Christians. Yeah. God is not only woundable, God is wounded.
And within all of that too is the sense of God's humility, that's not only something we can see in Jesus, which again is very evident in Jesus's life, as well as in our, New Testament understanding of the person, like Jesus Christ, not just the person of Jesus, but Christ in terms of what he chooses to do in an eternal sense. But then I think that sense of the act of humility in creation, the act of humility even in Scripture, in kind of entrusting humans with so much of the work of what God is doing. Wow. Yeah. So anyway, we're on the same page about all of this, I think, but it's really cool to have some other ways to think about that. And one of the quotations, this is from, on page 45 of Strong and Weak, you talk about that we reflect the image of God in our authority over creation and in our vulnerability in the midst of creation, which I think just kind of echoes what you were just describing. That's right. And I'm wondering if you can give a little bit of just a vision for human flourishing. Like, what are the necessary conditions for flourishing? Are there examples of flourishing? Why don't we live into that? When do we live into that? Kind of any of those directions.
Well, I mean, so maybe we can initially just think about how the Bible shows the first human couple. They're in a garden, which is, it's like a human scale environment where human beings can make a difference. So if you put human beings in total wilderness, that actually, how much authority do we really have in the wilderness? I mean, there's a place for going to the wilderness and realizing I am very small and I can't do anything to this mountain or this ocean or whatever. Right. But God actually prepares an environment that's the right scale for them to exercise authority. So that's kind of interesting. But then and in a way they start out in that safety corner, right? Because it's fairly insulated aside from the presence of serpents, apparently. But then the divine command is be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth. So they're not meant to stay in this safe environment. They're actually meant to gradually, I would say, garden the world. That is, move out into all the different biomes, as we call them, all the different ecosystems. And in each one respond, ideally, if they were fully bearing the image of God, with deep attention to the possibilities of that place, create culture in that place. You'd end up with all the multiplicity of human cultures naturally this way, because every human culture responds to its environment. So the Scandinavians come up with, is it called hygge? Very cozy, right? Yeah. Well, cozy is not really what you need in like the Polynesian islands, so you would end up with cultural diversity. And that would all be humans in a way exercising their authority over the world. But of course, that would also involve the vulnerability of leaving that safe environment and moving out. So it was built in from the very beginning that we were meant to move out beyond where we were. So you asked, what does flourishing look like? I think it looks like when you move out beyond the safety that was your initial condition, if you were fortunate and if your parents were able to provide that environment. And you move kind of to the edge of possibility, of discovery, and this can happen in so many, now my wife can do this do it with a microscope in a sense. Like she can stay in one place, but go deeper and deeper down to the smallest, coldest, shortest things in the world and examine them as a human being and discover that there's possibility there that's waiting for human beings to describe it and then create in response to it. All of this involves risk. And you don't know what you're going to find at that edge. So, anytime we do that. So, I mean, another very obvious thing, and it's one of the things that I've most loved about your writing is parenting. Our children especially, of course, see the authority that we have as parents when they're small in particular. But the moment that child is born, and before even, it's so vulnerable. And it's just both at the same time. Like I get to shape the world of my children, especially in their early years, with unmatched authority. I mean, which is terrifying in a way. Right. But I'm also exposed to the possibility of loss like no other relationship I can think of. Even marriage in some ways. I think it doesn't have quite the same quality of just of total authority and total, like, oh my goodness, my heart leaves the house every time my daughter goes off to kindergarten, So yeah, all the best moments
are in those places.
It's those two things together.
All right, so this is a bit of a pivot, but it's also in relation to this idea of authority and vulnerability. We are speaking right now, we're recording this conversation on November 2nd. It will come out into the world on November 3rd, which is to say the day of the United States presidential election. And I am thinking about the political realm when it comes to applying these ideas. And there is a part of Strong and Weak where you're speaking specifically about and writing specifically about leaders. So are we looking for leaders who have authority and vulnerability? Like, is that kind of a way to, I don't know. And I don't know if evaluate's the right word, because one of the things you also talk about is like the significance of sometimes having to protect that vulnerability from people from seeing it. So I'm curious, how do we apply this to the political realm? How do we think about these things when we're looking at politics?
So a couple thoughts. One is, I think it's understandable, and it's also mysterious, given that we were made for vulnerability. But we have this very deep instinct that says, I'd actually rather not have that, and I don't think that's necessary. So the serpent picks up on this in the garden. And the serpent says, why have a tree for the tree? And the woman says, well, because we'll die. So she has a sense of vulnerability with respect to the tree. She has a sense of vulnerability with respect to her maker in a way. And the serpent says, oh, no. God knows if you eat that, you're going to know good and evil. So you're going to have way more authority than you currently have. You'll be like God, the serpent says, and you shall not surely die. In other words, you're not as dependent, you're not as mortal, you're not as frail as God is trying to tell you. And the woman and the man take that bargain. They're like, oh, that sounds good. Be like God, authority, high authority, but we won't actually die. In other words, lower vulnerability.
Right.
So that's a preface to say that in every human individual and in every human system, there is for some reason, I'm not sure I totally know why, a flight from vulnerability. There's a desire to be told by someone whispering in our ear or shouting, I suppose, you can be in control or you can be safe. You can kind of choose your corner. Do you want to go high authority? Then you can be in control. Or do you just want to be safe? Like, and when you look at what politicians promise, it's very rare that they promise vulnerability. It's very rare that they say, you know what? For us to flourish as a nation is going to take risk. It's much more common for them directly or indirectly to say, vote for me and we'll be in control and in charge, or vote for me and you'll be safe and protected. And there are versions of this on both sides of any given partisan line. because this promise can play out in different ways. But the other thing you have to introduce into this is that politics is ultimately about force. It's about, this is Max Weber, the sociologist, said the one thing the state, so-called, the nation state, claims for itself is a legitimate monopoly on force, or a monopoly on legitimate force. The state is the one entity in our society that can force you to do something you don't want to do. And when you think about where do you get control from, it's from the ability to make things happen, not invite things to happen or not wish for things to happen. You get control when you can make things happen. And that always, or very often, involves force. So what's at stake in almost every election? There are moments when we have leaders in American life and in other nations who actually do that up into the right thing. So Lincoln's second inaugural address, he is in the midst of prosecuting a terrible war, a war that he and many people felt was necessary, that I would say was almost certainly necessary. Mm-hmm. And in the midst of that, he gives the second inaugural address in which he disavows any claim that God is on one side or the other. He says the Almighty has his own purposes. They're very mysterious. And honestly, we are all under judgment. If the judgment extends that a drop is drawn for the sword from every drop that's been drawn for the lash, we would still say the judgments of the Lord are just. He refuses to say, vote for me and our side will be in charge and that'll be good, even though he believes the Civil War is necessary.
Right.
John F. Kennedy at Rice University, in, I forget the exact year, the Sputnik year, gives this famous speech where he launches the mission to the moon. Mm-hmm. And the kind of most famous line in the speech is, "We choose to do these things not because they're easy, but because they are hard." And here again, you have someone saying, we're going to take this massive risk, huge financial investment, huge technical challenge. We don't know if we can do it. We're going to send real human beings to this satellite of our planet. And he's like, we're going to do it because it's hard. To me, that is, and so you notice I've got a Republican and a Democrat, Abraham Lincoln and John F. Kennedy. Okay, both sides can do this, but it's so rare.
Right.
And what's much more common, we could leave to listeners to fill in the details, or if you want to make me fill it in, I can. But most of our leaders, we actually want them to play out for us authority without vulnerability. Yeah. And I think it's clear that happens in presidential elections as well as at many other levels of politics.
Yeah, I actually don't think we need to fill in any beyond that. I think that's really helpful, though, as a framework for thinking about what's going on right now. But then my next question is, so if we're talking about human flourishing and a nation, a society flourishing, how much does a national election matter? I mean, obviously we can look for those leaders who are unusual in that ability to articulate a desire for risk. But even in the examples you gave, they weren't campaigning on risk, right? They were already in their positions and doing, I mean, I don't know what they were campaigning on, but I'm also thinking about one of the things, I do think national politics really matter. I've also been convicted in recent years of my knowledge on the national level and lack of knowledge on the local level.
Right.
And I wonder how much that same dynamic plays out or not when it becomes more local, where there is more of a sense of because what I was thinking about when you were talking about that removal, why it is that we as humans don't want to be vulnerable, I was thinking about the ways in which vulnerability and love and relationships are tied up in each other, where the only way, I think, to be giving and receiving love, with whether that's with God or with another person or even with some aspect of the creation, is through some measure of vulnerability. Yes. So yes, able to be wounded, but also that's that opening and that position of humility and of receptivity. And I do wonder where it's the national, the farther you get away from those relationships, the more likely you are to get away from that vulnerability. Yes. But then the more you bring the relationships, and again, local level, that's, it's I know, literally, actually know the people who are running for both sides, quote unquote, of the aisle in terms of being the first selectman in my town, and
Yes.
first selectman or first select woman in my town, right?
Yes. Yes.
And so I think there's just some vulnerability that comes simply
Yes.
in those relationships, and I wonder whether that actually, those are the places where, when it comes to politics, there's more likelihood for that flourishing. I don't know. That's just what comes to mind.
I think that's so right. And I mean, one of the macro stories of American political life is the increasing, and there's all these inputs to it. It's been going on for at least 2 generations now, is the increasing concentration of power, actual effective power, first of all at the federal level and instead of the local level. And then also in the executive branch of government as opposed to the legislative branch.
Right.
And when you think about it, the world the framers of our Constitution designed, first of all, was local in ways we can't even imagine. The federal government had so little power, which is reflected, by the way, in something. I think Doris Kearns Goodwin observes this, that before the Civil War, the United States was a plural noun. The United States are such and such. And it wasn't until after the Civil War, which did establish kind of a new level of federal power, that it became the United States is. It became a singular thing.
I did not know that.
It was also always the states that happened to have united under this Constitution, right? So power was very local. And we have this federal system that one of its great strengths, arguably, is the devolving of power to states. And we're seeing that even like in coronavirus response, right? Actually, the CDC actually has no power. The state governments are the ones that tell you, are you under quarantine or not? It's the governor of your state who can tell you that, not the president of the United States, let alone the CDC. So first they had this incredible local conception of power with only specific powers enumerated for the federal government. Most powers were at the state level, at that relational level,
right? More
relational. Second, they had 3 branches. And it's interesting how now when we say a national election, I know what I think and what every listener immediately thinks is the president line. Well, you're also going to be voting for sure for your House of Representatives, probably for a member of the Senate from your state. But we have sidelined those legislative roles, and now so much is concentrated and this is real. Like there's real concentration of power in the presidency. And think about how much more vulnerable legislation is than executive order.
Right.
So legislation does involve relationship. It involves compromise. It involves debate where you get on the floor of the Senate or the House and you make your case, but then someone else gets to stand up after you. But when the president issues an executive order, it's done. If it's within the scope of his powers or her powers, it's done. And I think that's actually part of why we become fixated on the president. Because we want that person in control.
Yeah, I think that's really fascinating to think about, just the possibility for flourishing when it comes to legislation, which is essentially what you just said. But I agree. And I think it's really important for us to recognize, as much as who is president does matter, there's so many other ways in which we can be approaching this question of what does it mean for our nation to flourish.
Yes. All
right, so I want to move to the topic of privilege. And I shared with you my working definition of privilege ahead of time, and you said I would get to hear yours when we spoke. So I'm just going to read my definition for listeners who may or may not have heard me say this before. And then I'm going to do so because, and here's what I'm thinking about. I'm thinking about that quadrant that you've called safety up until this point. Where you've got low authority, low vulnerability. But one of the things you write about in Strong and Weak is that there are people who could be flourishing, but who have that authority, the potential for high authority and high vulnerability, but they choose not to. And they choose to revert to that quadrant of safety, and you call that withdrawal. And that is like a place where I just feel like I resonate a lot with the potential for withdrawal. I mean, anyone who's been following me on Instagram knows that when I was preparing for this interview last week, I put a photo up of myself having taken a run in the rain.
Oh, wow.
It was like 40 degrees and rainy. And literally, if I had not read Strong and Weak, I would not have taken that run. But I was like, I am preparing for an interview with Andy Crouch. I'm going to take the risk. And I'm
going to flourish, damn it.
Exactly. And it was great. It was glorious. But just that I am one of the people who can like swaddle myself in the bubble wrap and go into that withdrawing stance, right? Like, so, but I do think there's a sense of, there's both passivity that can come there, but there also can be a sense of helplessness. Like there's not much, there can be a sense of not having authority when we're in that place. So all of this gets back to privilege in the sense that what I tend to, how I think of privilege is a set of unearned social advantages that lead to unjust social division. So if we were like really perfect human beings, even if I got something that was unearned and advantaged me, I would just figure out a way to share it. So I'm not sure that under all circumstances, but under the circumstances of our broken, sinful conditions, we don't think that those advantages are unearned. Like we'd like to think we earned them. And B, we might even not think they're advantages, right? So, but I know as a white, educated person who was born into married parents and affluence and all of this stuff, that I got lots of advantages I didn't earn. And that then led to me when I didn't recognize that, and even to some degree, as I do, participating in unjust social division. So that's how I think of privilege.
That's great.
And I think that many people of privilege could choose flourishing, right? To be in that place of high authority, high vulnerability, and instead, myself included, choose withdrawal.
Withdrawal. Totally.
So I'm going to kind of hand it over to you to talk a little bit about how you see privilege, if you want to, but also what's going on in that withdrawal, in that sense of passivity, helplessness, all those things. Right.
So good. I think, of course, what you're naming there with that definition is very real and very powerful and very important. So I'll give you the way I've thought about privilege, which is, I actually think is quite congruent with what you're saying. It just puts it in maybe a slightly different context or maybe a bigger context. So here's how I've tended to define privilege. I wrote about this in Playing God. I have a whole chapter on it. Just if people want to go read more, or if I don't say this clearly right now, I tend to define it as the ongoing benefits of past successful exercises of power. The ongoing benefits of past successful exercises of power. So privilege are the things that come to me today because of some successful exercise of power in the past. Now, I have to unpack that a little bit to get it to connect to your definition, which it does. So a couple things. Well, the thing about exercising power is I actually think anytime you exercise power, you end up with risk. So now when we think of power, we almost always think of coercion first. We think of making something happen, and that definitely can be part of power. But I would also want to include in power very much the act of creation. So coercion is making something happen using existing stuff. It's like rearranging stuff in the world the way you want it. Creation is bringing something into being that doesn't exist yet. And that's also, I would actually say that's a much deeper form of power than making people do things. So power can be creative, power can be coercive, and then within coercive, there's force, which is neutral, there's coercion, which is against resistance, and there's violence, which is actual violation of others or even of things, violating their intended purpose to get them to do what you want. So even coercion is not, coercive power is not always just one thing. And any of those are a risk. So even if you're a lieutenant in the army, where you have command and control powers over I'm sorry, I don't know the military well, your squadron or whatever the level of unit is, you give an order, right? And in the military system, like pretty much that order has to be obeyed. But in fact, there's always a risk. Like the people you're giving orders to have guns. They can turn around and say, no way, and they can shoot you, right? So even high coercion situations, there's risk involved in the exercise of power in the moment, let alone in environments of creative power, like writing a book, for example, where you're taking all kinds of risks at every stage of creation, let alone parenting a child.
Right.
So here's where I'm going with this. In the moment of exercising power, you're always at risk. But you can exercise power in such a way that the act recedes into the past, but the benefits continue. So I wrote a book called Strong and Weak. It came out in 2017.
Right.
All the risk is in the rearview mirror for me.
Right.
Like, it was risky to write that book. It was a risk for my publisher to write me a check and kill trees and so forth. All that's, 4 years, three or 4 years behind us. And today, Amy Julia Becker wants to talk about my book and introduce her audience to me and have a conversation with me. What is that? That is privilege. That's an ongoing benefit of a risk I took years ago. Now, even more, let me just put a finer point on it. That book has done okay, and it did better than the publisher expected. So they gave me an advance on my royalties, right? That has to be paid back by earnings from the book. Well, as it happens, it's sold enough copies that we call it made back its advance.
Yep.
So every October, this just happened 3 days ago, I get a check from my publisher of money, that are my royalties in excess of the advance.
Yeah.
And I did nothing to earn that.
Right.
It just appeared in my bank account.
Right.
And do you know what? For human beings, that's like magic. It's like, oh my goodness, I didn't have to take any risks. I could stay in my basement and that check would still arrive.
So this is my question on your definition in terms of the idea of the successful exercise of power.
Yes.
Because if someone, like, it seems as though successful exercise of power can be just or unjust.
Yes, it can. Completely. Yes. Okay. Successful just in the sense that you got
what you wanted.
That your action was meaningful.
Right. But so, like, in other words,
kind of
the privilege that you're describing is like a great one. And everyone would be like, yeah, hey, you're getting your royalties, right? Like, I think that's just like terrific. Whereas there are other exercises of power that confer benefits that go forward that are part of what's tearing us apart right now in thinking about and trying to wrestle with, because they either came from a place of injustice, can perpetuate some measure of injustice, et cetera. Okay. So that's
so that's like the next step is realizing most of the benefit. So I'm framing privilege first of all as actually a good, in principle, a good thing. It's benefits. It's good. It's a good thing. Yep. It's good that we're having this conversation today. And I would very naturally say, it would come naturally to me to say, it's a privilege to get to talk to you. Like, we would use the word that way, meaning it really is a good thing. But it didn't come because I took a huge amount of risk in the present. It comes from risk in the past. But most of the benefits we enjoy come from a tangled legacy of past exercises of power, some of which were highly creative and beneficial and beautiful, and others of which were forceful, coercive, or violent. And this is where privilege gets complex because, all right, my grandparents, you and I share a heritage in the American South. My mom is from Georgia. My grandparents, I would say, were very, they had their issues, but they were caring, loving people who were, among other things, very frugal, and passed on to me a small but real amount of financial wealth that helped me graduate from college. And that is in large part because they loved me in a way more than their own needs. They were not people of that anyone would have thought of as great wealth, but they allocated their resources in such a way to care for me. So they exercised a kind of power in doing that. And that side of my inheritance from my grandparents is a good exercise of power. At the same time, they were, as we call it, white Southerners. when my grandmother died, or I guess it was my grandfather died after my grandmother, I was looking through family papers. I found papers from the 19th century with the name of the slave that my ancestor had owned. Now, my ancestor didn't own a plantation, didn't have hundreds of slaves, but one of my ancestors owned at least one person who was enslaved to that ancestor. And that is also an input into the world that made it possible for my grandparents to save their money, while the African-American families who lived literally on the next plot of land had no opportunity to accumulate and save that kind of money. Now, I just get the money.
Right.
What do I do with that?
Yep.
So one reaction is like total guilt and say, oh, that comes ultimately from an unjust system. Absolutely true, but only partially true.
Right.
The other is to say, I'm not responsible for enslavement back in the 19th century. My grandparents were good, loving people. They were good, honest, middle-class Americans. They saved so their grandson could go to college. And that's to only focus on the positive exercise of power. But in fact, what I've inherited is totally tangled up. And I can't tell you which dollars come from the enslavement and the injustice of the American South, and which come from the incredible discipline and character and love of my grandparents. It all comes in a package. And this is why I actually think it's a little misleading to focus on privilege only as the unjust side.
Yeah.
Because actually what I'm tempted to do with all of it, wherever it came from, is retreat from risk. So that royalty that I get, which let's just say for the moment that came from a totally beneficial exercise of power. I don't actually think that's true. Why did I get to write that book and say other authors who have incredible things to say never got the opportunity? There's actually some unjust systems, even in my getting to write Strong and Weak, right?
Yep.
But even the part that comes from totally good things, for me becomes an invitation to say, like the rich guy in Jesus's parable, he says to his soul, "Soul, you have plenty of stuff. You have plenty of benefits from your past work as a farmer. Now just build a big barn and settle down, eat, drink, and be merry." Yeah. And God's like, "Oh, you are a fool to think you can withdraw from your responsibility to your neighbors, from your responsibility to continue to create in the world. And indeed, at some point, you are going to face the ultimate vulnerability of death and judgment, and you're not ready." And instead, the guy's saying, I'm set. I've got everything I need. And what privilege does is it gives us the option to head to the left side of the 2x2, to either go to control or go to safety. And then, because we really want to be there, we will happily erect and perpetuate systems of injustice that keep us there. And that's how it connects to your definition. Because actually, in my desire, even just to keep the good things I've been given, I will gladly participate in systems that allow me to enjoy those things over on the left side of the graph, rather than putting my life and everything I have back at risk in order for me and others to flourish.
That is so helpful. And I do want to just follow up in something we've talked about before in terms of how easy it is to confuse blessing and privilege. And I think what you just said helps me even in my thought of that. I write about in White Picket Fences just this sense that for so much of my life I had said that the fact that my husband got this job under these what seemed to me unusual circumstances was answer to prayer, or in various other ways I got into this school, that was an answer to prayer. And it's and your parents didn't need to have you fill out financial aid forms. So is that really an answer to prayer, or is this a sign of the fact that you have some unearned social advantages? And I don't think it's so easy as I should in any way, to the example you just gave, say it's one or the other. And yet I do want to just ask, how do you understand blessing as distinct from privilege? And what does that have to do with flourishing? How are blessing and flourishing, if at all, related to each other?
Oh my goodness. That's very deep. I'm actually about to try to write on this too. So maybe it's good that you're asking me this question. I think we misunderstand blessing. So I have a couple thoughts. One is there are two threads in the biblical tradition that that we often are unwilling to read together. And they both come in what's called the wisdom literature of the Bible. One thread is mostly found in Proverbs. And it says, if you're a good person, well, it says, if you fear the Lord and therefore act with a kind of integrity and uprightness, then prosperity will come to you. And there's a lot of this, especially in the Hebrew Bible. And then right next to it is another book of wisdom literature, the book of Job, which is about someone who is completely righteous and yet, for reasons he certainly can't perceive, falls into something terrible happens to him. And his friends come and they offer the standard wisdom responses. Well, you must have done something wrong because the righteous flourish and the wicked perish. And the whole book of Job is this like beautiful poetic refutation of that idea. So that's one thought, is I think we all, every one of us lives with an implicit prosperity gospel, which is if I'm good, which can include I pray to get into Princeton or whatever, that God will hear my prayer if I'm a good person and if I'm really sincerely praying, and God will bless me. And the Bible just doesn't actually, in the end, underwrite that simple of view, even though it is also true that righteousness is seen by God and is in some way rewarded. So the other thought I have about blessing, though, is, this is what I've been thinking about recently, that it's very interesting that a lot of things that are actually called blessing in the Bible happen at a moment of tremendous vulnerability. So maybe the anchor text for blessing in the Bible is the blessings of the patriarchs on each of the next generation. So you think about the Jacob, who at that point is known as Israel, he blesses all the different sons. And well, what's the occasion for this? Well, he's about to die, right? So he is, and of course we know when Abraham, which son is it? Who tricks? Isaac's the one who gets old, and Jacob and Esau, Jacob comes and kind of gets the blessing when his father is so infirm that he can't distinguish the two sons from each other, right? There's an incredible vulnerability here. I think we think when God blesses us, it reduces our vulnerability. I think actually blessing happens in the midst of vulnerability and unto vulnerability. And so, another really important blessing text is Jacob and Esau end up with a, surprise, surprise, not the greatest relationship. And Esau gets really rich and powerful, and they run into each other, basically. And Jacob's like, fill in the blank. I am about to meet my very angry older brother that I stole the blessing from. And so he does this whole manipulative thing of sending all these gifts and sending all of his baggage ahead. But then he's left alone by this river. At midnight, he meets this man who he wrestles with all night, and neither one can really win. And he says, I won't let you go until you bless me. And the blessing is, you've been called Jacob, but you're now going to be called Israel, which means the one who contends with God, or the one with whom God contends, the one who struggles, the one with whom God struggles. And then the guy just touches him on his hip, and now he limps for the rest of his life.
What a blessing.
What a blessing. Well, so think about that.
Right.
So what was God doing in getting Peter that job and getting you that admission? It is very possible God was acting in opening up those opportunities for you. But God, if it was really biblical blessing, God knew that God's intention was, at least, that this opened you up to new kinds of risk and vulnerability.
Yeah.
And then you have to choose whether to narrate it that way or to narrate it the prosperity gospel way and say, I was a good girl and now I get the good things and that'll make me safe or make me in control, whichever you prefer today. Instead of, no, I was given this, and what is the limp in this that I'm met? Like, what's the burden that comes with this? What's the work of reconciliation to be done? Because that's what Jacob has to do next, is go meet his brother. And he has this kind of amazing reconciliation with his brother. So that, for me, is a way to not completely disavow the idea that God was acting beneficially to you, blessing you in those things. But God's plans for that were... It's like when Peter first meets Jesus, right? Jesus is like, hey, go out, set your boat out. Let's try some fishing. And Peter's like, Lord, we've been fishing all night. And they take in this huge haul of fish. Peter's just had the most prosperity gospel moment of his life, right? The ka-ching, like the slot machine has just delivered maximum number of fish. And Jesus is like, okay, now I'm going to teach you to fish for people. Like, right. You've seen how much blessing I can give, but actually I have this way deeper thing.
And I'm thinking about also the Beatitudes in terms of what Jesus names as blessed. And the way sermon, my pastor recently pointed out how the Beatitudes go from almost like a passive to active in the sense of blessed are the meek, blessed are those who, like this sense of to like those who are peacemakers, those who are persecuted for righteousness and justice, right? Like, and so anyway, I think that's also related to that sense of blessed are the vulnerable as they move into that place of authority. And guess what? You're going to limp like that. I don't know. That just really resonates with me. I have one kind of final question on all of this, and then I want to ask a little bit about what's coming ahead for you. But on just a very pragmatic level, I'm thinking about people like me who are tempted to withdraw to the left side and have the means to do that. What are ways to challenge ourselves or to accept the invitation, however we want to frame it, to participate in flourishing? Like pragmatic steps, a la running in the rain. But what can we do?
I always worry about pragmatic steps because, ultimately it's about responding to what God has before you, and it's so different for different people. But it's surely, the ultimate risk, you mentioned this, the ultimate risk is love. So I guess there's two categories. Who do I know already I've been given to love, and what risk is needed to love them better? So this involves almost, if they're a person with if they're an adult, a typical adult, it certainly involves conversation, right? It involves listening. It involves asking a question you don't know the answer to, or disclosing something you'd rather not disclose. So it's taking the next step towards love with the people you've already been given. And, who is my neighbor? Well, who is the wounded person that you could pass by? There's none of us insulated enough. None of us have purchased enough bubble wrap that we don't pass by visibly injured people and communities in the course of a week. I bet even in COVID time, really, because that can be on your street. I live on this beautiful street where every house has had a marriage fail. I look out my kitchen window and I think every house I can see has had a marriage fail, maybe one exception. That can be the fact that I drive to Interstate 95 from my house and I go through the city of Chester, a post-industrial city that has the highest level of violence in our state, gun violence. You have a neighbor who you don't know yet, who you probably need to get to know and include in the circle of love. There's lots of other things, also running in the rain, there's so many other things. And there are all these kind of disciplines that prepare us to be available to that neighbor. But I think it comes down to, when I finish this interview, I'm going to go upstairs. My wife and my daughter's home from college for a couple of days. They're going to be here. Do I take a risk, or do I just withdraw and get my tea and scuttle back down to the basement? And, do I love or do I withdraw? And then where do I go today? Who do I see today? Who do I include in my circle today who's not in my circle normally? To me, that's ultimately what it's going to come down to. And then, of course, what is unfolded in response to those risks I take will tell me what my next step is for those people, for that community, for the systems I'm embedded in.
And it will become more and more, to your point early on, that it is also, flourishing is risky, but not in a why don't you go jump off a cliff type of way,
Right.
where you're just going to get harmed. You're opening yourself
Right.
up
Completely.
to harm, but you're also opening yourself up to wonder and delight and connection and beauty. And so
Totally.
I think as we actually like kind of practice that and live into it, the risk is to use maybe an overused phrase or something, but worth it. Like it's like, yes,
Yeah. It's meaningful.
yes, it's meaningful. There you go.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, we're coming to the end of our time, and I want to finish just by asking you to speak a little bit about the book that you're working on, just to give us a little sense
Sure.
of what you're thinking about. And then I also want to talk about a book that is coming out in a couple of weeks, but we'll come back to that.
Yeah, so I'm taking a risk. I'm trying to write a short book about a massive topic, which is basically technology, really two massive topics, technology and what it is to be a person. Small themes, what it is to be a person. Because we've ended up with basically with a very powerful world because of technology. And technology, by the way, is the way we ultimately realize this dream of control. It's all built on control, really, because we discovered enough about the world to be able to control parts of the world. That's what technology lets us do. And technology also makes us very safe in certain ways, allows us to withdraw. So we've ended up very powerful and very lonely. And living actually in a very impersonal world, I would say. And I think it's because of what we've wanted technology to do, and that we've wanted it to do something that actually the world was never meant to do, which is give us control and safety. So this is a book about how we got to be so lonely, how we can actually redesign our world for real people, for persons, really. And incidentally, there's a whole chapter on the difference between being charmed and being blessed. And a lot of the book is about how technology promises to let us do magic, and magic says you can have what you want just like without any risk, or just with a blink of an eye or the uttering of a spell or something. And so then the flip side is actually building our lives around those who for whom magic doesn't work. And so this includes people with disabilities. This includes the oldest members of our community, the youngest, the people who basically like scramble our sense of control are actually the people who teach us how to be persons. So that's the next book.
I just interviewed someone named Sarah Hendren a couple weeks ago.
Oh yeah, what a body wants, or
what a body can do.
What a body can do. Yeah.
But she has a quote in her book saying that. And not from like a Christian perspective, but saying that disability is fundamental to humanity.
Yes.
And I have been really, thinking about that idea. I'm excited, certainly for this next book of yours, but also, I have learned from you that your daughter Amy has a book coming out, which seems in some ways related to what you are working on, but also related to your book, Tech-Wise Family. Will you just tell us about that for a sec?
Yeah, maybe the number one thing parents have said when they've read The Tech-Wise Family is, do you have something my kids could read from a kid's point of view? So a lot of families have done what you've done and read it with
made their children read it. They liked it. I mean, it was, decent.
Man, I think there's a whole generation of kids now, because this is my best-selling book, Tech-Wise Family. I think there's this whole generation of kids for whom that terrible red book that their parents, red cover, that their parents made them read or made them live by, they're going to resent the name Andy Crouch for the rest of their lives. But what they've said is, your book is great. The parents have said this, but it's not written from a kid's point of view. Is there anything like from a kid's point of view? And so Amy, my daughter, who is now 20, wrote the foreword to The Tech-Wise Family. And it's this beautiful little 3-page, hey, you want to hear what it was like from a kid's point of view? And our friend Tish Warren, who's a writer, said to me a couple of years ago, she said, you really should get your daughter to write the follow-up book. And we actually did. So
That's
it's called
cool.
My Tech-Wise Life, Growing Up and Making Choices in a World of Devices. And it's mostly by Amy. She wrote it when she was 19. She just turned 20. So it's a teenager's point of view.
So cool.
On growing up in a family that did some things differently. But she's also had all the normal experiences, because we were not anti-tech in the end. So she's lived with all these things that her whole cohort generation lives with. And it's a beautiful book about all the ways it can mess us up and all the ways that we can be rescued from it. And then I write little letters to her at the end of each chapter, just kind of responding. But it's 90% my daughter's book.
And coming out in November, right?
November 17th.
Okay.
Yeah, My TechWise Life.
Awesome. It's on its way.
Yeah, it's exciting.
Well, I can't wait to read it, see it. I will be on the lookout, and I am excited that you guys got to do that together. That's so fun. And my kids will be excited too, Marilee especially, because she was not forced to read TechWise Family. So she's young enough that she'll get to read the teenager version.
Yeah, there you go. There you go.
Well, Andy, thank you so much. I really personally benefited from this conversation, but I'm sure that listeners will say the same, and especially in a time of so many questions and lots of angst, to be able to think about what it means to be people who flourish, both in and of ourselves, but also on behalf of and kind of for and within other people, before and within God's loving care. I'm really grateful for that today.
Wow. Thank you so much for the invitation to talk.
My pleasure. Thanks. Thanks so much for listening to Love is Stronger Than Fear. As a final note, we have a few weeks left this season in this podcast. So if you're a listener, I would love to hear from you. I'm thinking about starting a new season in a few months, and I would love to know what has been valuable to you in the conversations that have been offered so far. You can reach out to me directly. My email is amyjuliabeckerwriter@gmail.com. You can also find a contact link at amyjuliabecker.com. Or just leave a review on this podcast, wherever you get it. I'll see that. You could share this podcast online and just tag me on Facebook or Instagram or Twitter, and then I'll see what you have to say about whether we should keep having these conversations, and if so, what really matters to you? What's been valuable to you in what I have been able to talk with people about? I'm also really grateful to our host, Breaking Ground, and I do want to mention I have an essay with Breaking Ground that I mentioned in the show today. It's an essay about God and love and control and the election. So if you want to hear more about that part of the conversation today, or I guess read more about it, you can find that at breakingground.us. And as always, I have to say thank you to Jake Hansen for doing a masterful job of editing this podcast, and in this case on very short notice. To Amber Beery, my social media coordinator, who has just handled everything so well. She does far more above and beyond I could ever ask for, and I'm so grateful to her. And I will tell you that next week I'm going to be talking with David Bailey, the director of Erebon. He was actually on episode 1 of this season of the Love is Stronger Than Fear podcast, and we're going to circle back to him after the election and see what's going on and what he's thinking about. And we're going to talk about acting justly and loving mercy. So I hope you'll join us next week. Finally, as you go into your day today, I hope you will carry with you the peace that comes from believing that love is stronger than fear.